Daniel had always believed that certain places carry memories just as strongly as people do. For him, that place was the lake. It was not just a body of water surrounded by trees. It was a part of his identity, a living reminder of his family's long history. When he was a boy, he often followed his grandfather down the narrow path through the woods, holding his small hand tightly as they walked. At the end of that path, the lake would appear suddenly, glistening in the sun like a silver mirror. His grandfather would pause, take a deep breath, and say, "This is ours. Not to own, but to protect." Those words stayed in Daniel's heart for the rest of his life. The land itself was not fancy or developed. It was raw, filled with tall oaks and pines, bushes heavy with berries, and wild flowers that covered the fields in spring. Deer would sometimes step quietly out of the woods to drink at the edge of the lake. Birds circled above, dipping down when the fish rippled the surface. At night, the air was filled with the songs of crickets and the slow hum of frogs calling to each other. It was a place alive with balance. To Daniel, it was perfect just as it was. As he grew older, Daniel came to understand why his grandfather valued the lake so deeply. His grandfather had been a farmer, working hard on the surrounding fields. The soil gave crops only when treated with respect. The family had survived hard years of drought and floods because of the lake. It was the water source that saved their fields during dry spells and the barrier that protected their land from harsh storms. The dam his grandfather had built generations earlier kept the water steady, never too high or too low. Daniel had learned how to maintain it from a young age, clearing away branches, adjusting the old gates, and making sure nothing blocked the water's flow. But more than survival, there was something spiritual about it. Sitting beside the lake felt like sitting beside an old friend. Daniel would often bring his fishing pole, even if he wasn't planning to catch much. He enjoyed the quiet, the way time seemed to slow down while the sun drifted across the water. Some days, when the wind was still, he could see the reflection of the trees so clearly on the surface that it felt like looking into another world. After his grandfather passed away, the responsibility of caring for the land and the lake fell on Daniel. He was still young, but he understood the importance of what he had been given. People around him often told him to do something with the land. They suggested he sell parts of it, build homes, or open a campground. Why let it just sit there, they would ask. But Daniel never thought of the land as wasted space. To him, it was already complete. He couldn't imagine cutting down the trees or paving over the soil. Life around the lake was not easy, though. Being the caretaker of such a place required constant effort. Every season brought challenges. In the spring, heavy rains tested the strength of the dam. In the summer, weeds grew thick and had to be cleared before they choked the small streams that fed the lake. In the fall, leaves piled high and clogged the waterways. In the winter, ice formed along the edges, and Daniel had to watch carefully to make sure the pressure did not damage the gates. It was hard work, but it was honest work. And it made him feel connected not just to his family, but to the earth itself. Neighbors sometimes stopped by and asked why he cared so much. To them, it was just water and land. But for Daniel, it was a story. Every ripple on the lake's surface, every bird that landed on its edge, every memory of walking hand in hand with his grandfather, all of it was part of something greater. He felt as if he was not only protecting the land, but also protecting the spirit of those who came before him. Even when he worked jobs in town or traveled to nearby cities, Daniel always felt a pull back to the lake. He would come home, sit by the shore, and find peace again. He noticed how the lake could heal him after long days of struggle. When he faced disappointments, he would talk to the water quietly, almost like it could listen. And in those quiet talks, he often found answers. The stillness reminded him that problems could be solved with patience, that storms always pass, and that growth takes time. The community around him grew slowly over the years. More families moved into nearby towns, businesses opened, and roads were built. But Daniel remained content in his simple way of life. He never tried to keep people away, but he also never invited them to build or expand near his land. He believed everyone could enjoy nature if they respected it, but not everyone understood what respect meant. Sometimes children from the town would come to play near the water. Daniel would smile as they skipped stones across the surface, laughing when they managed to make one bounce more than 3 times. He liked seeing their joy, but he also made sure to remind them, kindly but firmly, take your trash with you. The lake is not a place to leave behind what you don't want. Most of them listened, and he hoped they would remember the lesson when they grew older. In many ways, Daniel's life seemed simple, almost uneventful to those who only saw it from the outside. But inside, it was rich with meaning. Every day he woke up to the sound of birds calling, every evening he watched the sun dip low and turn the water golden. He felt wealthy in ways money could never measure. He didn't own expensive cars or large houses. What he owned was time to care, time to notice, time to live in harmony with what was around him. Looking back, Daniel often thought about his grandfather's words. Not to own, but to protect. He realized that this idea guided everything he did. To own something meant to control it, to bend it for one's use. To protect it meant to let it be what it was meant to be, to defend it against harm. And that was the role Daniel chose for himself, the guardian of the lake, the quiet friend of the water, the man who lived not for power or wealth but for balance. What Daniel didn't know then was that his devotion to this place would soon be tested. The peaceful days by the water, the balance he worked so hard to maintain, would not last forever. Change was coming. And with it, decisions that would challenge everything he believed about ownership, protection, and respect. Daniel had always known that beauty often attracted attention. The lake, quiet and hidden for so many years, was beginning to draw more eyes. At first, it was just a few hikers who heard about the place and wandered in to see the water shining between the trees. Then it was a handful of fishermen from nearby towns, hoping to catch the big fish that lived deep in the calm waters. Daniel welcomed them with polite nods. He believed the lake had enough to share, as long as people respected it. But soon, the trickle of visitors grew into a steady stream. The world beyond the small towns was changing fast. Roads were being built wider, cars became more common, and people wanted escapes from their busy city lives. Word spread that there was a hidden lake surrounded by unspoiled forest, a place where the air felt fresher, the nights darker, and the mornings full of bird song. What was once Daniel's quiet retreat started appearing on maps and travel guides. Daniel noticed the changes slowly at first. He would see more strangers parking their cars along the dirt road that led into the woods. He saw people carrying cameras, taking pictures of sunsets, and sometimes leaving behind more than footprints. Empty bottles, wrappers, and bits of plastic began to show up near the shoreline. Daniel picked them up each time, shaking his head but refusing to lose patience. He told himself, maybe they just don't understand yet. Maybe they will learn. But not everyone wanted to learn. Some saw the lake not as a treasure to protect but as an opportunity to make money. One summer, a group of wealthy land developers arrived. They were part of a powerful homeowners association, known in nearby towns for buying land and building luxury vacation cabins. They came dressed in clean suits and shiny shoes that looked almost silly in the mud and grass by the lake's edge. Daniel remembered the way they stood, pointing across the water as if measuring it with their eyes, seeing not the fish, the trees, or the quiet beauty, but the profit they could make. When they approached Daniel, their words were friendly, but their tone carried a different meaning. They spoke about progress, opportunity, and modern living. They told him that people from the cities would pay good money to stay in cabins overlooking such a beautiful lake. They promised jobs, new roads, and a chance for Daniel to become wealthy if he agreed to let them develop the land. Daniel listened quietly, as he always did. He didn't argue, nor did he smile. When they finished, he simply said, "This lake is not for sale. It is not mine to give away." The men chuckled politely, as if they hadn't heard him properly. They explained again, this time offering larger sums of money, adding how his life would change. But Daniel repeated himself, firm but calm, "This place is not for sale." The developers didn't give up. Over the months that followed, they returned again and again, each time with more papers, more offers, and more promises. They even tried to convince him that his grandfather would have wanted progress, that protecting the lake was an old-fashioned idea. But Daniel knew better. His grandfather had been clear, the lake was to be protected, not exploited. Then one day, Daniel discovered something that shook him deeply. The Homeowners Association had found a way to purchase land around the lake from distant relatives of his, people who no longer lived in the area and had no connection to the place. They didn't see the land as sacred, they saw it as unused property, and they sold it willingly. The association moved quickly, clearing trees and leveling ground. Soon, the sound of saws and hammers filled the air where there had once been only bird calls and rustling leaves. Daniel stood at the edge of the lake, watching the first cabins rise. He felt a heaviness in his chest, not from anger but from sorrow. The quiet harmony he had guarded for so long was breaking apart. The cabins were not built with respect. They stood tall and sharp, cutting into the landscape like intruders. What had once been open space for deer and foxes was now fenced off. Paths that had been soft with moss were covered with gravel and concrete. The people who came to stay in these cabins were different from the families who used to visit for a day to fish or picnic. They were visitors who saw the lake as entertainment, not as a living part of the earth. They played loud music, lit fires without care, and left behind trash despite the bins Daniel placed nearby. Some even cut down young trees to clear better views of the water, never thinking of the damage they caused. Daniel tried to speak to the leaders of the association. He explained gently, telling them about the history of the land, about his grandfather's work, and about the delicate balance of the lake. But they laughed, telling him the past didn't matter anymore. To them, the lake was nothing more than a backdrop for profit. It wasn't just the noise or the cabins that troubled Daniel, it was the way the water itself began to change. With so many people using it carelessly, oil from boats leaked into the surface. Trash floated where fish once leapt freely. The water level grew less steady as streams feeding into the lake were diverted for construction. Daniel noticed the fish were fewer, the birds less frequent, and even the trees along the bank looked weaker. Nature was showing signs of struggle. At night, Daniel would sit by the shore, the glow of cabin lights reflecting off the water where stars used to shine undisturbed. He remembered the way it had been when he was a boy, silent, pure, almost magical. Now the sound of laughter and engines filled the air. He didn't hate the people, but he couldn't understand why they could not see what was being lost. Neighbors who once admired Daniel's dedication began to question him. Some told him to accept change. Others reminded him that he could have been rich if he had sold his land too. But Daniel didn't care about money. He cared about what was slipping away, something that money could never bring back once it was gone. As more cabins were built, Daniel knew he was facing a choice. He could continue to stand quietly, picking up trash and shaking his head as the land was consumed, or he could take action to protect what remained. His grandfather's words echoed again, "This is ours, not to own, but to protect." The weight of that responsibility grew heavier with each passing season. Daniel began walking the perimeter of the lake daily, not just to observe but to think. He studied the way the water flowed, the way the dam held it steady, and the way nature tried to resist the changes forced upon it. Deep down, he knew that the lake had a strength people had forgotten, a strength hidden in plain sight. And though he did not yet say it aloud, a quiet thought began forming in his mind. If the association could not respect the lake, then perhaps the lake itself would need to remind them of its power. Daniel had always carried the memory of his grandfather's lessons close to his heart. One memory, in particular, began to rise in his mind more often now that the lake was under pressure from careless hands. He remembered being a young boy, barely tall enough to see over the wooden rail of the dam. His grandfather had knelt beside him, pointing to the steady trickle of water that slipped through the gates. This dam, his grandfather had said softly, is what keeps the lake alive in this way. But never forget, Daniel, the water is older than us, stronger than us. We guide it, but we do not own it. If people forget to respect it, the water knows how to take itself back. At the time, Daniel had not fully understood what those words meant. To a child, the dam was just a wall of stones and wood, something that always seemed to be there. But now, standing as a grown man, watching 139 cabins spreading along the shoreline, the meaning began to come into focus. The dam was not just a wall, it was a choice. His grandfather had chosen to tame the water, to create a steady, calm lake that fed their crops and gave balance to the land. But if that choice was undone, if the water was allowed to move as it once had, then nature would return to its old rhythm. For years, Daniel had maintained the dam faithfully. He cleared the debris after storms, oiled the hinges on the gates, patched leaks when they appeared, and reinforced its structure with new timbers when needed. To him, it had always been an act of care. But now, he found himself walking the length of it at night with new eyes. He ran his hand over the rough stones and weathered beams, wondering how long it could hold if he stopped watching it so carefully. He noticed tiny leaks, the kind he would have quickly sealed in the past, and left them untouched. The thought unsettled him. He was not a man of destruction. He loved life, he loved peace, and the idea of letting something go undone felt against his nature. Yet the cabins rising higher, the laughter and shouting echoing across the water, and the sight of oil streaks floating on the lake made him wonder if silence and patience were enough anymore. Daniel began to spend more time near the dam, sometimes at dawn, sometimes long after dark. He studied the way the current pressed against the gates, the way the water gathered strength when rains came, the way the pressure built behind the wall. It was as though the lake itself was whispering to him, reminding him of its true power. He imagined what it might look like if the dam was opened fully. The water would not rage in anger, it would simply return to its natural course, flowing into the marshes and forests that had once embraced it. During one of these quiet nights, Daniel remembered a story his grandfather had told him. Long before the dam, the land was a wide wetland filled with tall grasses, winding streams, and countless creatures. The people who first lived there had understood the floods, adjusting their lives to match the rhythm of the water. It was only later, when farming began, that the dam was built to hold the water steady. Nature bends for us only for a time, his grandfather had said. But when it needs to, it will stand up again. That story came alive in Daniel's mind now. He began to realize that the dam was never meant to last forever, it was meant to serve as long as people treated the land with care. Now, with outsiders cutting down trees, poisoning the water, and treating the lake like an amusement park, perhaps the time had come to release it. Still, Daniel did not rush into action. He spent weeks wrestling with the thought. Every day, he saw more evidence of harm. Some mornings he found plastic floating along the edges. Other times he saw trees marked with spray paint, ready to be cut down for yet another cabin. He noticed how the fish he once caught with ease were harder to find. The balance he had cherished was slipping away before his eyes. He also thought about the people. Not everyone who came to the cabins was careless. Some families sat quietly by the shore, teaching their children to fish or watching the sunrise with gratitude. Daniel felt no anger toward them. But the system around them, the association, the developers, the endless push for profit was something different. It was larger than individuals. It was a machine that would not stop until every tree was replaced by a building and every sound of nature was replaced by the hum of engines. One evening, as Daniel sat on the dock with his fishing pole resting loosely in his hands, he watched the sun sink low, painting the water gold. Across the lake, he could see the cabins glowing with artificial lights. Music drifted faintly through the air. He closed his eyes and thought again of his grandfather's voice, "If people forget its value, the water will know what to do." Daniel opened his eyes slowly. He understood now. His grandfather had not been speaking in riddles. He had been giving him a choice for the future. The dam was not permanent. It was a trust, a responsibility, and if it no longer served the land, then it could be let go. The next day, Daniel walked to the dam in the early morning. Mist rose off the water, and the air was cool against his skin. He walked slowly, listening to the soft creaks of the wooden beams as water pressed against them. He crouched down, placing his hand on the damp stones, and felt the vibration of the current underneath. The water was alive, waiting, carrying a strength that had been held back for generations. He didn't touch the gates that day. He didn't loosen them. But he made a quiet decision within himself: he would no longer maintain the dam as he had before. He would allow time and nature to do what they were already beginning to do. He would stop patching leaks, stop replacing beams, stop reinforcing the walls. Instead, he would watch, wait, and let the water speak for itself. From that moment on, Daniel's relationship with the dam changed. Where once he had hurried to fix every small crack, he now stood back and observed. Each creak, each drip, each shift in the wood felt like a step closer to something inevitable. He felt a mix of sadness and relief: sadness for what the lake had lost, but relief in knowing that nature would not be defeated forever. At night, he lay awake in his small cabin on the edge of the woods, listening to the faint rush of water through the dam. He imagined what the land might look like once the water returned to its wild course: cabins surrounded by marsh, roads swallowed by wetlands, and silence returning where noise now ruled. It was not revenge he imagined, but restoration. The homeowners' association carried on without noticing. They built more cabins, boasting in brochures about the steady, calm lake that offered peace and beauty to visitors. They had no idea that the calmness they advertised depended entirely on a dam they did not even see, a dam now quietly weakening under the weight of time and water. Daniel carried the secret in his heart. He said nothing, but his eyes grew sharper, his steps more purposeful. The choice had been made. He would let the water do what his grandfather had always trusted it could. And though no one around him realized it yet, a shift had already begun. The seasons passed slowly, but Daniel felt the change begin almost at once. By choosing not to repair the dam, he had given nature permission to move again. At first, the difference was small, almost invisible to anyone but him. A little more water slipped through the cracks after a heavy rain. The boards groaned under the weight of the current in ways they hadn't before. The dam, which had stood firm for generations, was starting to loosen its grip. Most people didn't notice. Visitors came to the cabins in greater numbers, still taking pictures of the lake and boasting about its beauty. The homeowners association was busy advertising vacation packages and building a few more cabins near the water's edge. To them, the lake seemed steady, calm, and reliable. Only Daniel could see that the calmness was changing, becoming less steady each week. The first real sign came one stormy night in early spring. Rain fell for hours, pouring into the streams that fed the lake. Daniel, sitting by his window, listened to the sound of rushing water louder than usual. The next morning, he walked to the dam and saw something he had expected: one of the old boards had cracked, allowing a stronger flow of water to escape. Years earlier, he would have replaced it immediately, patching it with fresh timber. This time, he only stood quietly, watching the water rush through. It wasn't dangerous yet, but it was enough to remind him that the lake was stirring. Weeks later, the water line began to shift. Families staying in the cabins didn't think much of it at first. They only noticed that the water crept closer to their porches after each rainfall. Children even played in the rising shallows, splashing and laughing. But Daniel knew what it meant. The dam was giving way, slowly but surely. The balance was changing. Some cabin owners complained to the association, saying the lake seemed too high and asking for adjustments. The leaders promised to look into it, but none of them understood the dam the way Daniel did. They didn't know its history, its weak spots, or its quiet warnings. They simply assumed the lake would remain the way it always had, because they believed money and plans could control everything. Summer arrived, bringing more visitors than ever before. The cabins buzzed with activity, barbecues, boat rides, and loud music at night. The water, however, kept rising quietly. Grasses near the shore disappeared under shallow pools. Frogs, once singing only at the edges, began calling from new wetlands forming where paths used to be. Birds returned, drawn to the growing marshy areas. Daniel smiled to himself. Nature was already beginning to reclaim what was hers. Then one evening, after another stretch of heavy rain, the change became impossible to ignore. A section of the dam broke apart completely, sending a surge of water into the lower fields. The sound was deep and powerful, like thunder rolling through the earth. Daniel stood nearby, watching with calm eyes. He knew this moment would come, though even he was humbled by the sheer force of it. The water rushed forward, carving new paths through the land. The next morning, panic spread among the vacationers. Several cabins near the shore were now standing in several feet of water. Wooden steps disappeared under the rising lake. Furniture was dragged away by the current. Some visitors packed their bags quickly, frightened by the thought of more flooding. Others complained angrily to the association leaders, demanding answers. But the truth was simple: the lake was taking back its space. The Homeowners Association scrambled to find solutions. They brought in engineers to inspect the dam. The experts shook their heads, noting its age and the lack of maintenance. Repairs would take months, maybe years, and cost far more than anyone expected. Meanwhile, the water continued its steady climb. Daniel watched it all unfold without gloating. He did not cheer at the sight of cabins sinking or people leaving in frustration. He simply observed, knowing this was the natural course of things. For too long, the land had been bent to serve human plans. Now, it was bending back. As weeks turned into months, the transformation grew more dramatic. Entire porches were swallowed. Pathways once used for morning walks disappeared beneath water. Roads built to carry cars to the cabins were cracked and muddy, no longer passable. Wildlife returned in greater numbers: herons wading in the shallows, turtles basking on half-submerged logs, fish darting through the newly freed streams. The forest seemed to breathe easier, as if relieved of a heavy burden. Some families who had visited the lake for years were saddened to see their favorite cabins unlivable. But many locals, who remembered the land before it was built up, nodded with quiet understanding. They told stories of how the area once looked, with wide wetlands and streams stretching as far as the eye could see. "The land is remembering itself," one old farmer said. The association, desperate to save their investment, tried one last effort. They attempted to build barriers around the cabins, piling sandbags and even pouring concrete walls. But the water was patient and relentless. Each rainstorm weakened their efforts. Each flood carried away pieces of their work. The more they resisted, the more obvious it became that nature could not be controlled. Through all of this, Daniel kept to his routine. He walked the shoreline daily, observing the changes with a calm heart. Sometimes he sat with his fishing pole, though fishing had become harder with all the disturbance. Other times he simply watched the sunset reflect on the expanding waters, knowing he was witnessing something few people ever saw: a lake returning to its true form. One evening, a young couple who had been visiting for several summers approached Daniel. Their cabin had been abandoned as the water crept too close. Instead of anger, they carried curiosity. "Did you know this would happen?" they asked. Daniel looked at them for a long moment before replying softly, "The water always remembers where it belongs." By autumn, more than half the cabins stood empty. Some were already collapsing into the lake, their foundations rotting in the water. The Homeowners Association faced financial ruin, unable to sell or rent properties that were no longer safe. Investors pulled out, abandoning the project altogether. Nature had made her decision, and no contract or promise of profit could reverse it. And yet, for all the loss, something beautiful began to grow. New streams formed where roads once lay. Grasses and reeds sprouted quickly, turning old paths into meadows. Birds filled the air with song. Fish thrived in the fresh water pouring through the broken dam. Even the air smelled cleaner, carrying the rich scent of earth and growing things. Daniel often thought about his grandfather during those days. He imagined him standing beside him, nodding slowly as if to say, "Yes, this is what I meant. The water knows what to do." Daniel felt no pride, only peace. He had not forced the change, he had simply stepped aside and let it happen. The cabins, once symbols of wealth and ownership, became silent reminders of what happens when people forget the value of nature. They stood half-sunken, their windows reflecting the sky, slowly being covered by vines and moss. In time, even they would disappear. The lake and the land were patient. They had waited generations before, and they would wait again. For Daniel, life continued much as it always had. He woke with the sunrise, walked along the water, and cared for the land in his quiet way. Only now, he no longer felt the same burden. The balance was returning on its own. The water had spoken, and the cabins had listened in the only way they could by leaving. When winter arrived, the lake looked different from the way it had only a year before. The water had spread wider, swallowing much of the shoreline where cabins once stood proudly. Snow lay gently across the landscape, covering the abandoned porches and fences. Some cabins stood crooked, leaning like tired travelers, while others had already collapsed into the rising wetlands. To anyone passing by for the first time, it would have seemed like the remains of an old village that nature had decided to take back. Daniel walked along the icy banks, his breath clouding the cold air. Each step crunched softly against the snow, and he felt a calmness inside him that he hadn't known in years. The fight, if it could even be called that, was over. Nature had reclaimed its ground, and the homeowners' association had quietly disappeared, leaving behind only broken buildings and unfinished promises. He remembered when the first cabins were being built, how loud the saws and hammers had been, how quickly the trees had fallen. Now, the only sounds were the gentle lap of water against frozen wood, the distant call of a bird, and the whisper of wind moving through the bare branches. It was as if the land itself was sighing with relief. By early spring, when the snow melted, Daniel could see new life beginning to push forward. Shoots of green rose from the wet soil. Fresh grasses spread across areas that had once been driveways and footpaths. Frogs returned in great numbers, filling the nights with their songs. Birds built nests in the branches above, no longer disturbed by constant human noise. Even the fish population, which had dropped sharply during the years of heavy activity, seemed to rebound in the deeper waters. Daniel spent hours each day observing these changes. He wasn't just watching, he was witnessing healing. It was like watching a wound close slowly, layer by layer, until the skin became whole again. The scars of the cabins remained, but they too were fading. Nature had a way of covering what people left behind, wrapping broken beams and stones in moss and vines, softening every sharp edge until it blended into the earth. Word spread in nearby towns about what had happened. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, while others said they had expected it all along. "You can't fight water," one old man said at the market. "It always finds a way." The story of the 139 cabins that vanished under the lake became a cautionary tale, reminding people that not all land was meant to be conquered. Occasionally, curious visitors would come to see the ruins. They walked carefully along the edges, whispering about the cabins half submerged in water, taking pictures of the wild plants growing through old windows. Many of them left with a new respect for the power of the natural world. Daniel rarely spoke to them, but when he did, he only said one simple truth: the lake is not gone, it just remembered itself. In time, the cabins became less noticeable. Roofs collapsed, walls gave way, and what remained was slowly covered by plants. Within a few years, it was hard to tell where the structures had once stood. The water and the forest were patient, and together they erased the signs of human intrusion. For Daniel, life settled into a new rhythm. He no longer carried the same burden he once had, rushing to maintain the dam and worrying about the cabins. Instead, he embraced the peace of watching the land live freely. Each morning, he brewed his coffee and sat by the water, listening to the sounds of life returning. He saw deer come closer now, no longer frightened by crowds. He watched herons glide across the lake, their wings brushing the surface as they searched for fish. The community's view of Daniel began to shift as well. Where once some neighbors had thought him stubborn or old-fashioned, now they saw him as a man who had simply understood something they had forgotten. People came to him with questions about caring for their own land, about how to live in harmony with nature instead of against it. Daniel answered patiently, never claiming wisdom but simply sharing what his grandfather had once told him. Not to own, but to protect. Children especially liked to visit him. He taught them how to skip stones across the water, just as he had done as a boy. He showed them how to watch for ripples that meant fish were near, or how to identify the tracks of animals in the mud. He reminded them to always take their trash with them, telling them gently that the lake had no hands to clean up after them. The children listened, wide-eyed, and many of them promised to remember. As the years passed, the story of the cabins faded into the background, but the lake continued to thrive. The dam, once a symbol of control, now stood in ruins, broken and scattered. Daniel never rebuilt it. He didn't need to. The water had found its balance without it, spreading into marshes and streams that supported more life than ever before. What some might have seen as loss, Daniel saw as restoration. One summer evening, Daniel sat by the water with his fishing pole. The sun was setting, painting the sky with colors of gold and pink. The lake reflected it all, glowing like fire on glass. He thought about his grandfather again, about the lessons he had been given as a child. He realized now that his grandfather had not just been teaching him about farming or fishing, he had been teaching him about patience, respect, and trust. Trust in the earth, trust in the water, trust in the balance of life. Daniel smiled to himself, feeling grateful that he had listened. He didn't feel like a hero. He didn't feel like a man who had defeated anyone. He simply felt like a guardian who had stepped aside at the right time, allowing nature to remind everyone of its strength. The cabins were gone. The association was forgotten. The investors had moved on. But the lake remained, as it always had, stronger than before, alive with the sound of wind, water, and the calls of countless creatures. Daniel cast his line into the water, watching the ripples spread outward. He knew he wouldn't live forever, but that no longer worried him. The land would remain, and the lake would continue to tell its story long after he was gone. Perhaps, someday, a child would sit where he sat now, listening to the water and remembering the lesson passed down through generations. Not to own, but to protect. The thought filled him with peace. He leaned back, watching the last light fade across the lake, and felt at home in the only way he had ever wanted to be, living quietly beside the water, in harmony with the land, trusting that nature would always know what to do.